September 17th, 1942. The rain had stopped an hour before dawn, but Private Takeshi Noda could still hear water dripping through the canopy above him. His hands shook as he unwrapped the last fragment of his rice ration, a portion no larger than a child's fist that had to sustain him until nightfall. The cotton bag that once held 16 days of provisions now hung empty against his hip, testament to 47 days of advance through mountains that defied every assumption Japanese intelligence had made about this godforsaken track. Around him, 43 men of the Third Battalion lay scattered in exhausted sleep among the roots of trees whose names they did not know. They had started with 186. Some had fallen to Australian bullets. Most had simply stopped walking, their bodies unable to extract one more calorie from muscles that had been consuming themselves for weeks. Noda pressed the rice between his palms, compacting it into something he could swallow without chewing. If he chewed, if he tasted it, his body would demand more. The trick was to make it vanish quickly, to give his stomach something to process before his mind could register how insufficient it was. He had learned this on the third week, watching men who savored their rations begin to weep from the cruelty of remembering flavor. Behind him, Corporal Hideaki Matsumoto coughed, a wet rattle that had become the morning's most reliable sound. Matsumoto had been a fisherman's son from Hokkaido. Before, the army taught him to maintain machine guns with the precision that his father's generation reserved for net repairs. Now he weighed perhaps 45 kilograms, down from the 72 recorded in his induction physical. His uniform, tailored for a larger man, draped over his frame like cloth over scaffolding. Before we continue deeper into this story of hunger and the discovery that would shatter everything these men believed about their enemy, subscribe below and tell us where in the world you're watching from today. The Australian supply depot sat 200 meters ahead, abandoned during the retreat 3 days prior. Japanese scouts had reported its existence, but said nothing about its contents. Depots meant ammunition, perhaps medical supplies, if fortune favored them. Noda did not allow himself to imagine food. Hope, he had learned, was a form of torture when applied to things you could not control. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamada assembled the platoon at 0600 hours. 28 men stood at attention, their movements careful, economical. Every gesture required calories they did not have. Yamada himself had the hollowed look of chronic starvation, cheekbones pressing against skin that had lost the subcutaneous fat that once cushioned his face. But his uniform was still correctly buttoned, his sword still polished. Discipline, he had told them repeatedly, was what separated the Imperial Army from animals who merely survived. The Australians left supplies, Yamada said, his voice carrying despite its weakness. We secure the depot, inventory contents, and prepare for redistribution. Sergeant Tanaka, you lead the entry team. 6 men. Move carefully. They may have left traps. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka selected his team with the calculation of someone choosing pieces for a game where every move mattered. Noda was chosen third. At 22, he was among the youngest, which meant his body had marginally more resilience than the older soldiers whose peacetime years of adequate nutrition had not prepared them for sustained deprivation. He slung his rifle and followed Tanaka down the muddy track that passed for a trail. The depot had been a mission station before the war. Stone foundation, corrugated metal roof, wooden walls, weathered grey by tropical rain. The Australians had left the door open, either from haste or from the knowledge that anything valuable had already been taken. Tanaka approached with his rifle raised, gesturing for the others to fan out. Inside, the structure was dim, light filtering through gaps in the wallboards. The air smelled of mildew, rust, and something else that Noda's starving body identified before his conscious mind could process it. Fat, cooked meat, the scent was so foreign after weeks of rice and nothing else that several men stopped walking, their faces registering confusion before recognition. Wooden crates lined the far wall, stacked 3 high. Tanaka moved toward them, using his bayonet to pry open the nearest box. The lid came free with a screech of nails against wood. He stared inside for several seconds, not moving, not speaking. Then he reached in and pulled out a small, rectangular tin, turning it over in his hands as if verifying its reality. "Bully beef," he said quietly, reading the English words stamped on the label. "Corned beef, Australian." Noda moved closer. The tin was perhaps 12 centimeters long, 8 wide, 3 deep. The label showed a picture of beef, sliced and pink. The weight in Tanaka's hand suggested perhaps 400 grams of actual food, more protein than their entire platoon had consumed in a week. And the crate held dozens of identical tins, packed tightly in rows. Another soldier had opened a second crate. He held up a tin twice the size of the beef, this one labeled with English words none of them could fully read, but with a picture that required no translation. Golden biscuits, stacked in neat rows. Hard crackers, the kind that would keep indefinitely, that could be eaten without preparation, that represented calories in their purest, most portable form. Tanaka's hands were shaking now. He set down the beef tin carefully, as if it might shatter, and opened the third crate. This one contained smaller tins, perhaps 200 grams each, with labels showing fruit. The English word peaches meant nothing to Noda, but the illustration of sliced yellow fruit in syrup was unmistakable. Fruit preserved in sugar, sweetness that his body had not tasted since leaving Rabaul 3 months before. "How many crates?" Tanaka asked, his voice tight. 17, someone replied from the far end of the building. "No, 18. Another stack behind these." Noda did the mathematics automatically, a skill drilled into him during supply training. 18 crates, perhaps 30 tins, per crate, 400 grams per tin, 216 kilograms of food. Enough to feed their platoon for weeks, enough to feed the entire battalion for days, enough to mean that no one would have to compress rice into tasteless pellets tomorrow morning. But Tanaka was still staring at the beef tin in his hand, and his expression had shifted from relief to something darker, more complicated. Noda recognized it because he felt it too, a realization creeping through the initial joy like cold water through fabric. The Australians had left this behind, not hidden, not buried, not even particularly protected. They had simply abandoned it during their retreat, along with whatever other supplies they deemed too heavy or too inconvenient to carry, which meant this depot represented not the Australians' primary provisions, but their surplus, what they could afford to lose. "Open the other crates," Tanaka ordered. "All of them. I want inventory." The next hour revealed contents that transformed the initial discovery from remarkable to impossible. Tinned vegetables, perhaps 40 kilograms, bags of sugar, crystalline and white, each bag weighing 5 kilograms, tea, actual tea leaves, not the bitter bark substitute Japanese quartermasters had begun issuing, tobacco, tins of cigarettes with English branding, chocolate bars wrapped in waxed paper, each one the size of Noda's palm, condensed milk in small tins, jam, multiple varieties, labeled in English but with pictures showing strawberries, apricots, plums, and in the corner, stacked almost casually, were crates containing not food but food preparation materials, salt, far more than any military unit could need, baking powder, flour in sealed tins, spices whose names Noda could not read, coffee, genuine coffee, in quantities that suggested the Australians drank it daily rather than as an occasional luxury. Private Yoshiro Takahashi sat down heavily on one of the crates, his rifle clattering to the floor beside him. He was 24, a farmer's son from Kyushu, who had written letters home about the inadequacy of their rations since landing at Buna. He picked up one of the chocolate bars, turned it over, read the English words he could not understand, and began to cry. Not the quiet, suppressed tears that exhausted men sometimes shed at night, but open sobbing that shook his entire frame. "We're losing," he said, his voice thick. "We've already lost. Look at this. Look at all of this. They left it behind. They didn't even need it enough to carry it." Tanaka moved toward him, perhaps to offer discipline or comfort, but stopped halfway, because Takahashi was right and everyone in the depot knew it. The mathematics were undeniable. The Japanese Third Battalion had advanced through the Owen Stanley Range, carrying 16 days of rice per man, supplemented with whatever they could forage, operating at the absolute edge of logistical possibility. And they had been told this was adequate, that this level of supply represented the full commitment of Imperial resources to the Papua campaign. But the Australians, retreating, undersupplied, at the end of supply lines stretching back to Port Moresby, had been eating corned beef and biscuits and fruit in syrup. They had been drinking coffee and tea. They had been smoking cigarettes and eating chocolate. And when forced to withdraw, they had abandoned quantities of food that exceeded what the Japanese considered adequate for an advance. Noda opened one of the bully beef tins using his bayonet. The meat inside was dense, pink, flecked with fat. He used his knife to extract a small piece, perhaps 20 grams, and placed it in his mouth. The flavor overwhelmed every sense. Salt, fat, protein, the texture of actual meat against his teeth. His body responded with an almost painful intensity, saliva flooding his mouth, his stomach contracting. He swallowed and immediately felt dizzy, his vision briefly doubling. "Slowly," Matsumoto said, though he was doing the same thing, eating directly from a tin of beef with his fingers. "Our stomachs aren't ready for this. Eat too fast and you'll vomit." But the warning came too late for Takahashi, who had consumed an entire chocolate bar in perhaps 30 seconds and was now bent over, retching in the corner. His body, accustomed to starvation, rejected the sudden influx of sugar and fat. He vomited twice, violent heaves that brought up the chocolate along with what little else his stomach contained, then sat gasping, tears still streaming down his face. "This was nothing to them," he said when he could speak again. "This whole depot, it's less than what they carry as a matter of routine, and we're celebrating like we found treasure." Lieutenant Yamada arrived with the rest of the platoon an hour later. By then, Tanaka had organized the supplies into categories and calculated approximate totals. Yamada listened to the report in silence, his face unreadable. Then he walked to one of the crates, extracted a tin of peaches, opened it with his knife, and drank the syrup directly from the tin. His throat worked as he swallowed, once, twice, 3 times. When he lowered the tin, his expression had not changed. "Redistribute immediately," he said. 2 days' rations per man from these supplies. Send a runner to battalion headquarters with inventory. The colonel will determine allocation for the rest." "Sir," Tanaka said carefully. "Permission to speak." Yamada nodded. "The men are discussing what this means, the volume of supplies, the fact that the Australians left it behind. They're drawing conclusions about comparative industrial capacity. And those conclusions are that we cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy who can afford to abandon this much food." Yamada stood silently for perhaps 30 seconds. Around them, soldiers sorted through crates, their movements mechanical, their faces showing a mixture of relief and something darker. Finally, the lieutenant spoke. "The supplies prove the enemy's weakness, not their strength. They require excessive provisions because they lack the spiritual fortitude to endure hardship. We advance with 16 days of rice because we are disciplined. They retreat burdened by comfort because they are soft. This depot demonstrates why we will ultimately prevail. Our spirit is stronger than their material." The words were correct, properly formed, exactly what regulations required an officer to say. But Yamada's voice carried no conviction, and no one in the depot appeared to believe him. The lie was too transparent, the evidence too overwhelming. You could not look at 18 crates of abandoned food and conclude that the side doing the abandoning was weaker. Noda received his allocation shortly before noon. 2 tins of bully beef, 1 tin of biscuits, 1 tin of fruit, a small bar of chocolate, and a packet of tea. 48 hours of food that weighed perhaps 2 kilograms and contained more calories than he had consumed in the previous 10 days. He packed them carefully in his kit, feeling the weight shift against his back. That evening, the platoon made camp 3 kilometers further along the track. Yamada authorized the use of captured supplies for the evening meal, calculating that the morale benefit outweighed the strategic advantage of hoarding. Men opened tins and ate in near silence, their faces illuminated by small cooking fires that regulations normally forbade. Noda consumed his allocated beef slowly, forcing himself to pause between bites. The meat sat heavy in his shrunken stomach, and twice he felt nausea rising, but he kept it down, his body gradually accepting the protein it had been denied for so long. Beside him, Matsumoto ate biscuits, one by one, chewing each thoroughly, his eyes closed. "My daughter is 3 years old," Matsumoto said quietly. "She was eating rice mixed with chaff when I left, sweet potato stems when available. My wife wrote that the ration allocation dropped again in June. They're down to 200 grams per person per day in Hokkaido, less in the cities." He opened the tin of peaches, looked at the fruit suspended in clear syrup, and began to weep. "They're starving at home. My family, my neighbors, everyone I know. And the Australians are eating this." He gestured at the peaches, at the beef tins scattered around the camp, at the evidence of abundance that surrounded them. Not as a luxury, as routine, as what they carry into the field and abandon when it becomes inconvenient. Noda had no response that would not deepen the wound. The comparison was too stark, the disparity too vast. You could not reconcile 200 grams of rice mixed with chaff against tins of beef and fruit in syrup without confronting truths that made the war itself seem impossible. "We were told America was soft," another soldier said from across the fire. Private Daichi Ito, age 19, who had been conscripted straight from his father's textile factory in Osaka. "That they were addicted to luxury, that our spirit would overcome their materialism. But this isn't luxury. This is just how they eat, and we can't match it. We never could." "Enough," Tanaka said sharply. "That kind of talk serves no purpose." "What purpose does not talking serve?" Ito responded. "We're going to die in these mountains, regardless of whether we acknowledge the truth. At least, let us die, understanding why." The conversation ended there, but the silence that followed was heavier than any words. Men finished their meals, cleaned their tins, and prepared for sleep. But the mood in camp had shifted irrevocably. The discovery of the Australian depot had not brought the joy of unexpected provision. It had brought the crushing weight of mathematical certainty. Noda lay on his mat, staring up at the canopy where rain was beginning to fall again. His stomach felt fuller than it had in weeks, but the satisfaction was tainted by understanding. Tomorrow, they would continue advancing toward Port Moresby, living on captured supplies until those ran out, at which point they would return to rice rations that kept them ambulatory, but slowly consuming their own muscle tissue. And the Australians, retreating ahead of them, would continue to be supplied by ships from Port Moresby, by planes that dropped provision crates, by a logistical system that treated tins of beef and chocolate bars as ordinary rather than extraordinary. The question was not whether Japanese spirit could overcome Allied material superiority. The question was how long discipline could sustain men who understood they were fighting an enemy that operated in a different category of abundance entirely. He thought about the depot, about the 18 crates they had discovered, about the certainty that this was not a unique supply point, but representative of how the Australians ate, about the implications for a war that Japanese leadership had promised would be decided by willpower rather than industrial output. And he thought about his mother in Nagano, about the rations she was likely receiving, about the comparison between what his family ate and what his enemies abandoned. The rain intensified, drumming against leaves and turning the track to mud. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was crying, quietly. Noda closed his eyes and tried to sleep, his full stomach offering no comfort against the knowledge of what the depot had revealed. The captured supplies lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, they returned to rice rations, and the hunger resumed as if it had never left. October 9th, 1942. The rain had not stopped for 36 hours. Corporal Hideaki Matsumoto sat under a makeshift lean-to, constructed from palm fronds and rotting canvas, watching water cascade off the edge in sheets. His rice ration, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, had still gotten wet. The grains had swollen with moisture and begun to ferment, giving off a sour smell that made his empty stomach contract with nausea. He would eat it anyway. There was no alternative. The Third Battalion had reached a position the maps designated as Noro, though the village itself was nothing more than scattered huts and a clearing large enough to serve as a dropping zone for air supply. Japanese intelligence had promised regular resupply once they achieved this position. The promise had proven false, as had most intelligence assessments about this campaign. They had been at Noro for 6 days. In that time, a single supply drop had arrived, delivering perhaps 2 days' worth of rice for a battalion that now numbered fewer than 400 effectives out of an original strength of 1,200. The rest had died, been evacuated too sick to continue, or simply disappeared into the jungle, their fates unknown and uninvestigated because the officers lacked the resources to search for missing men. Matsumoto ate his fermented rice directly from the oilcloth, forcing down portions that tasted of decay and rain. His body accepted it with the resignation of an engine burning whatever fuel remained available. Around him, other men performed similar rituals, consuming rations that would have been rejected as spoiled under any other circumstances. Private Noda approached from the direction of the command post, moving with the careful economy of someone whose body had been running on insufficient calories for too long. His face had lost all subcutaneous fat, giving him the skull-like appearance that had become standard among the battalion. But his eyes were alert, which suggested either good news or catastrophically bad news. In Matsumoto's experience, alertness in starving men only appeared in response to extremes. "Sergeant Tanaka wants you at the forward observation point," Noda said. "Says you need to see something." "See what?" "He wouldn't say, just that you need to come now." Matsumoto pulled himself upright, his joints protesting. He had turned 28 2 weeks ago. Though no one had marked the occasion, his body felt 60. He retrieved his rifle and followed Noda through the mud. The observation point overlooked a stretch of the track approximately 800 meters ahead. Sergeant Tanaka was prone behind a fallen log, looking through binoculars. 2 other soldiers flanked him, both maintaining silence. Tanaka gestured for Matsumoto to take position beside him and handed over the binoculars. "There," Tanaka said, indicating a point on the track below. "Watch for 5 minutes and tell me what you see." Matsumoto adjusted the focus and waited. At first nothing moved. Then figures emerged from the tree line, walking in loose formation up the track. Australian soldiers, he counted 8, no, 12, moving without the careful stealth of a patrol in enemy territory. They walked casually, almost leisurely, their rifles slung. The binoculars were German-made, exceptional optics, captured from a British unit in Malaya. Through them, Matsumoto could see details that should not have been visible at this range. The Australian soldiers were not emaciated. Their uniforms fit properly, suggesting bodies that still carried appropriate weight. One man was eating something as he walked, tearing pieces from what looked like a bar and chewing between steps. More figures appeared. These were not soldiers, but carriers, indigenous Papuans serving as porters. They moved under loads supported by straps across their foreheads, the traditional carrying method for this region. But the loads themselves made Matsumoto forget to breathe. Wooden crates, stamped with English text he could not read from this distance, but whose size and shape matched the crates from the abandoned depot. 1 carrier, 2, 5, 8 carriers, each bearing crates that represented more food than the Japanese 3rd Battalion had received in a week. "Supply column," Matsumoto said quietly. "Moving north. Keep watching." The column continued passing for another 4 minutes. Matsumoto counted 32 carriers, each bearing loads he estimated at 25 to 30 kilograms. 800 kilograms of supplies moving toward Australian positions that were falling back, retreating, allegedly undersupplied and desperate. Except the soldiers escorting the column showed no signs of desperation. One was smoking, the tobacco smoke visible even at this distance. Another was drinking from a canteen with the casual motion of someone who knew the canteen would be refilled. "They're supplied daily," Tanaka said when the column passed from view. "Yesterday, we observed a similar column. Smaller, perhaps 20 carriers. The day before, another." The Australians are maintaining regular supply lines even as they retreat, while we're eating fermented rice and waiting for drops that never come. Matsumoto lowered the binoculars. The mathematics were becoming impossible to ignore. A supply column of 32 carriers moving daily represented perhaps 800 kilograms per day. Multiply across the number of Australian positions, factor in airdrops they had observed, add naval supply to Port Moresby, and the scale of Allied logistics became visible in outline, even without precise numbers. "We can't match this," Matsumoto said. "Even if our supply lines were functioning perfectly, even if every promised drop arrived, we couldn't maintain this volume of supply." "No," Tanaka agreed. "We're operating at perhaps 1/10 their supply rate. Maybe less, and that's with our lines functioning. Which they're not." They remained at the observation point for another hour, but no additional columns appeared. Matsumoto committed the details to memory, knowing they would matter for the report Tanaka would file with Lieutenant Yamada: numbers, composition, estimated tonnage, direction of movement, facts that would contribute to the larger understanding of what the battalion faced. When they returned to camp, Yamada was meeting with the company commanders in his tent. Matsumoto waited outside while Tanaka entered to deliver the observation report. Through the canvas, he could hear voices, though not specific words. The meeting lasted perhaps 15 minutes before Tanaka emerged, his expression carefully neutral. "The colonel wants a patrol," Tanaka said. 8 men. Intercept and capture an Australian supply column. Bring back provisions and prisoners for interrogation." "When?" "Tonight. We leave at 2200 hours. Matsumoto had led night patrols before, but never this deep into enemy territory, never this undersupplied, never with the specific objective of stealing food. The mission parameters made clear what the battalion had become. Not an advancing combat unit, but a starving force attempting to sustain itself through scavenging. He selected his patrol carefully. Noda, because the young private moved quietly and followed orders without excessive interpretation. Takahashi, despite his earlier emotional break, because he could carry heavy loads. 4 others, chosen for their remaining physical capability rather than their combat experience. At this stage of the campaign, the ability to walk 8 kilometers and carry 20 kilograms back mattered more than marksmanship. They departed at the scheduled time, moving south along the track under minimal moon. The rain had stopped, but the mud remained, sucking at their boots with each step. Matsumoto maintained a pace he calculated could be sustained for 2 hours without depleting their already minimal energy reserves. Behind him, the patrol moved in single file, silent except for the unavoidable sounds of men walking through jungle. The ambush point was a location where the track narrowed between 2 ridges, forcing traffic into a constricted space with limited visibility ahead. Matsumoto positioned his men on both sides of the track, creating a simple L-shaped ambush with fields of fire that would converge on any column passing through. Then they waited. The Australian column appeared at 02:30 hours, later than Matsumoto had anticipated. 12 carriers, 6 Australian soldiers as escort. The Australians walked with the same casual posture Matsumoto had observed through binoculars, rifles slung, conversing quietly among themselves. One was humming, a tune that carried through the night air. Matsumoto let the first 3 Australians pass the ambush point before initiating. The goal was not to maximize Australian casualties, but to secure the supplies with minimal noise that might bring reinforcements. He fired a Single shot over the head of the lead soldier, the report echoing between the ridges. "Down! Weapons down!" Noda shouted in English, one of perhaps 15 phrases he had learned from a captured manual. "We shoot!" The effect was instantaneous. The Australians and carriers dropped to the ground, hands raised. No one returned fire. No one attempted to flee. They simply surrendered, their postures suggesting this was a routine interruption rather than a life-threatening ambush. Matsumoto and 2 others moved forward, weapons raised, gesturing for the Australians to move away from the supplies. The 6 soldiers complied without resistance, their faces showing irritation more than fear. One, a corporal, based on his insignia, was shaking his head in what looked like frustration at an administrative inconvenience. "Check the crates," Matsumoto ordered. Noda and Takahashi moved to the nearest carrier loads. The crates were stenciled with English text and numbers that meant nothing to Matsumoto, but their weight and shape matched the depot supplies. Noda used his bayonet to pry one open, lifting the lid to reveal rows of tins identical to those they had found weeks before. Bully beef, biscuits, fruit, and in the second crate, something new. Cloth bags, perhaps 1 kilogram each, labeled with English words but with a picture showing coffee beans. Noda opened one bag, inhaled, and looked up with an expression of disbelief. "Coffee," he said. "Fresh coffee, at least 20 kilograms of it in this crate alone." Matsumoto ordered the patrol to secure all 12 carrier loads while he questioned the Australian corporal. The man spoke slowly. Whether from limited Japanese or deliberate obstruction, Matsumoto could not determine. But certain facts emerged clearly. The column was routine supply, moving daily. This load was intended for a company positioned 4 kilometers ahead. They expected another column tomorrow, carrying similar provisions. "What happens if this supply doesn't arrive?" Matsumoto asked. The corporal shrugged. "Another column comes tomorrow. Or they extend from stores already on position. They'll be fine for a week, even without resupply." "A week? Standard practice, mate. Every position maintains week's supply as buffer, sometimes more if aerial drops are working well." Matsumoto translated for his patrol. The faces around him reflected his own reaction. A week's buffer supply. The concept was so foreign to Japanese logistics as to seem fictional. The Third Battalion was operating with less than 2 days' supply as standard, often less than 1 day, frequently on the edge of complete depletion. The idea that an enemy unit would maintain 7 days of provisions as routine buffer exceeded anything in Japanese military planning. "What do you eat?" Matsumoto asked, the question emerging before he could consider whether it was strategically useful. The corporal looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Your rations, daily. What do you consume?" Mornings, usually porridge or cereal, tea, sometimes eggs if supply's good, bully beef and biscuits for midday, evening meals, whatever the cooks can manage, with what we've got. Stew usually. Bread when the ovens are working. Tea and smokes throughout." Matsumoto did not translate this. The contrast was too devastating. The Australians were eating 3 meals daily, with variety, with hot food, with tea and tobacco as routine rather than luxury, while the Japanese Third Battalion compressed fermented rice into pellets and waited for supply drops that did not arrive. They secured the prisoners and began carrying the supply crates back to their position. Each crate weighed approximately 25 kilograms, requiring 2 men per load for the 8-kilometer journey through mud and darkness. The work consumed energy they did not have, but the prospect of what the crates contained made the expenditure worthwhile. They reached the battalion position at 0600 hours, exhausted and mud-covered, but successful. Lieutenant Yamada inspected the captured supplies personally, opening crates and conducting inventory, with the methodical precision of someone documenting evidence rather than celebrating victory. 12 crates total. Contents: 48 tins of bully beef, 60 tins of biscuits, 36 tins of mixed fruit, 24 tins of vegetables, 18 kilograms of coffee, 12 tins of condensed milk, 32 packets of tea, 40 bars of chocolate, miscellaneous condiments and supplies. Approximate total weight: 300 kilograms, caloric value, sufficient to feed the entire battalion for approximately 3 days at maintenance level, or 5 days at survival level. 3 days of food captured from a routine daily supply column that represented a fraction of Allied logistical capacity, and the captured corporal had said another identical column would move tomorrow and the day after. Daily supply maintaining week-long buffers at every position. Yamada authorized immediate distribution of captured supplies, calculating that morale was worth more than hoarding. Men received portions based on their previous day's work, with patrol members getting priority allocation. Matsumoto received 2 tins of beef, 1 tin of fruit, coffee, and chocolate. He sat on the ground and opened the beef, eating directly from the tin while his body responded with near-painful relief. Around him, 400 men consumed the captured supplies with the intensity of people who understood this might be the last good meal they would receive. Some ate quickly, gorging, despite knowing it would make them sick. Others ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if trying to imprint the memory against future starvation. A few could not eat at all, their bodies too depleted to process the sudden richness. Private Ito sat beside Matsumoto, drinking coffee that he had brewed using captured supplies and water boiled in his mess kit. The coffee was too hot, but he drank it anyway, his face showing something between pleasure and grief. "My father's factory supplied fabric for uniforms," Ito said quietly. "We worked 18-hour days, ate rice and miso twice daily, saved every gram of material, reused everything. The army told us shortages were temporary, that increased production would solve everything. But we knew, everyone knew, we couldn't produce enough." He gestured at the tins scattered around the camp, at the evidence of Allied abundance. "They're not struggling, they're not sacrificing, they're just operating normally, and their normal exceeds our maximum. We can't win. We never could. The industrial disparity is too vast." Matsumoto had no response that would not confirm what Ito had said. The mathematics were undeniable. Every data point reinforced the same conclusion. Japanese forces advanced, carrying minimal supplies, operating at the edge of logistical possibility, sustained by discipline and the promise that spirit would overcome material disadvantage. Allied forces retreated while maintaining daily supply columns, week-long buffer stocks, and caloric intakes that exceeded Japanese peacetime civilian rations. The war was not being decided by individual battles or tactical brilliance. It was being decided by industrial capacity, by the simple calculation of how much food could be moved, how far, how quickly, and on that measure, the disparity favored the Allies by orders of magnitude that made Japanese victory mathematically impossible. That night, as the battalion settled into sleep on full stomachs for the first time in weeks, Matsumoto lay awake thinking about the Australian corporal's words. Standard practice. Week's supply as buffer. Another column tomorrow. The casual certainty of someone who had never questioned whether supply would arrive. And he thought about the Japanese supply drops that did not come, about the promises of regular resupply that had proven false, about the fermented rice and the gradual consumption of their own body mass, about the comparison between what his side could deliver and what the enemy abandoned as routine surplus. The rain resumed sometime after midnight, and Matsumoto listened to it drum against the canvas overhead. In the morning, they would continue toward Port Moresby, living on captured supplies until those ran out, at which point they would return to starvation rations, and the Australians would continue falling back, supplied daily, maintaining their buffer stocks, never experiencing the hunger that had become the defining condition of Japanese existence in New Guinea. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow the hunger would return, and knowing that the captured supplies had not changed the fundamental mathematics of the campaign. They had simply delayed the inevitable by 3 days. The coffee lasted longest because they rationed it carefully, understanding its psychological value exceeded its caloric contribution. By October 13th, even that was gone. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. November 2nd. 1942. The retreat had begun 3 weeks earlier, though no one had used that word. Lieutenant Yamada had called it repositioning to more defensible terrain. The battalion commander had termed it strategic redeployment. The men knew it as flight. Corporal Matsumoto walked at the center of the column, maintaining position through habit rather than conscious effort. His body had achieved a state beyond exhaustion, operating on autonomous systems that kept legs moving and lungs functioning without requiring input from his conscious mind. Around him, 347 men performed similar operations, their faces uniformly vacant, their movements mechanical. They had started the retreat with 403 effectives. 56 had fallen behind in 3 weeks. Some had been too sick to continue and had been left at aid stations with medics who lacked medicine. Others had simply stopped walking, sitting down beside the track and refusing orders to continue. A few had died during the night, their bodies discovered at morning count lying in positions that suggested they had stopped breathing between one moment and the next, their hearts finally surrendering to demands they could no longer meet. The Japanese supply system had collapsed entirely. No drops had arrived in 12 days. The last rice allocation had been consumed 4 days ago. Since then, they had been living on whatever could be foraged, which meant almost nothing. The jungle provided sago palm pith, roots that required processing to remove toxins, occasional fruits whose names they did not know. Men had been eating leaves, bark, insects, anything that might contain calories their bodies could extract. Private Noda walked beside Matsumoto, though walked was generous description for the shuffling gait that kept him moving forward. His uniform, once tailored for someone weighing 70 kilograms, now hung on a frame that might weigh 45. His skin had taken on a translucent quality that made veins visible beneath the surface. His eyes had receded into his skull, giving him the appearance of someone who had been dead for several days, but whose body had not yet stopped moving. "The Australians are ahead," Noda said, his voice a rasp that barely qualified as speech. "I heard Sergeant Tanaka talking to Lieutenant Yamada. There's a supply depot at Kokoda. The Australians abandoned it yesterday when they fell back." Matsumoto processed this information slowly, his mind operating at reduced speed. A supply depot meant food. Food meant survival. The logistics were simple enough that even his depleted brain could follow them. "How far?" "Oh, 6 kilometers. 6 kilometers. Might as well have been 60. Matsumoto's body could probably manage another 2 kilometers before complete collapse. 3, if he pushed beyond what was survivable. 6 was impossible, without rest and calories he did not have. But impossibility had become relative. 2 months ago, the idea of advancing 47 days through the Owen Stanley Range on 16 days' supply would have seemed impossible. Last month, the concept of a 3-week retreat while eating leaves and bark would have seemed impossible. Now, 6 kilometers to reach food qualified as merely improbable rather than genuinely impossible. When do we reach it? Tomorrow morning, if we don't stop for the night. Matsumoto calculated the energy expenditure against potential gain. 6 kilometers at their current pace meant 9 hours of walking. Minimum. 9 hours of consuming calories they did not have. But if a supply depot waited at the end, the calculation became viable. "Barely. Tell the men," he said. "Pass it quietly. We march through the night." The information moved through the column like electricity through damaged wire, jumping from man to man in whispers and gestures. A supply depot. Food 6 kilometers ahead. The effect was minimal but measurable. Backs straightened slightly. Pace increased fractionally. Eyes that had been glazed found focus. They marched through the afternoon and into darkness, following a track illuminated only by what moonlight filtered through the canopy. Men fell periodically, collapsing forward or sideways, their bodies finally exhausting whatever reserves had kept them ambulatory. Others would help them stand, support them for a few meters, then let them sit beside the track when it became clear they could not continue. No one spoke. Speech required energy they could not spare. Matsumoto fell twice. The first time, he caught himself on his hands, pushed upright, and resumed walking without pause. The second time, he went down completely, his face pressing into mud that smelled of decay and rain. He lay there for several seconds, feeling nothing, thinking nothing, his consciousness reduced to the basic awareness that he was on the ground and should probably stand. Noda pulled him upright, supporting him until his legs remembered their function. They continued walking. Dawn broke grey and wet, the sky invisible behind clouds that pressed close to the canopy. Matsumoto had no memory of the last 3 hours of walking. His consciousness had fragmented, operating in discrete moments rather than continuous experience. He was aware of being upright. He was aware of moving forward. The connection between these states was absent. The village of Kokoda appeared gradually, materializing from fog and rain like something from a fever dream. Structures emerged first, wooden buildings with corrugated roofs. Then the airstrip, a cleared space running perhaps 400 meters, and at the far end, stacked beside what had been a warehouse, were crates, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, arranged in neat rows that suggested organization, rather than haste. The column stopped. Men stood swaying, staring at the crates with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something approaching religious ecstasy. No one moved forward. No one spoke. They simply stood, looking at evidence that food existed in quantities beyond immediate consumption. Lieutenant Yamada moved to the front of the column, his own gait unsteady. He had lost, perhaps, 25 kilograms since Buna, transforming from a compact, athletic officer into something gaunt and spectral. But his uniform was still correctly fastened, his boots still polished as well as conditions allowed. He surveyed the depot, then turned to face his men. "Secure the perimeter first," he said, his voice carrying despite its weakness. "Then inventory. Then distribution. We do this correctly, or we don't do it at all." Sergeant Tanaka organized security posts, while Matsumoto led the inventory team toward the crates. Each step across the airstrip felt precarious, as if his legs might fold at any moment, but he reached the first stack and stopped, reading the stenciled English text: Australian Army, field ration, beef. He used his bayonet to pry open the crate. Inside, packed tightly in straw, were tins identical to those they had captured from the supply column. Bully beef. Perhaps 50 tins per crate, and there were at least 60 crates in this stack alone. 3,000 tins of beef, 1,200 kilograms of protein, enough to feed the battalion for weeks. Noda opened adjacent crates, working with mechanical efficiency despite his physical state. Biscuits, fruit, vegetables, tea, coffee, sugar, chocolate, cigarettes, jam, condensed milk, crate after crate revealing contents that transformed the depot from supply point into something resembling mythology. Food in quantities that exceeded immediate comprehension. "How much?" Tanaka asked when they had opened 20 crates and begun extrapolating from the total count. Matsumoto did calculations, his mind struggling with mathematics that should have been simple. "Approximately 4,000 kilograms total, maybe more. Enough to feed the battalion for a month, maybe 6 weeks, if rationed carefully." "And the Australians left it?" "Yes." Tanaka stared at the crates, his face showing no expression that Matsumoto could read. Finally, he spoke. "They left it because carrying it was inconvenient. Not because they lacked transport, not because they couldn't protect it, because it was easier to abandon 4,000 kilograms of food and request replacement than to organize proper evacuation." The observation was accurate and devastating. The Australians had not been driven from Kokoda by force. They had withdrawn strategically, falling back to prepared positions closer to Port Moresby. And in withdrawing, they had left behind food that represented survival for the Japanese battalion, but mere inconvenience for themselves. Yamada arrived and conducted his own inspection. opening crates and examining contents with the thorough methodology of someone documenting evidence. He spent particular attention on a crate containing what appeared to be luxury items: chocolate bars, tinned sweets, chewing gum, cigarettes in quantities that suggested routine rather than special allocation. "This is their standard ration," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone present. "Not emergency supplies, not special operations provisions, standard field rations for units in combat." He pulled out a tin of beef, read the label, set it down carefully. Then he opened a package of chocolate, examined it, and placed it back in the crate with movements that suggested he was handling something sacred or cursed. Matsumoto could not determine which. "Redistribute based on physical need," Yamada ordered. "Most depleted men receive priority. No one is to consume more than 500 calories today. Their stomachs can't process more without becoming ill. Tomorrow we increase to 1,000 calories. By day 3, full rations." "Sir," Tanaka said carefully, "the men will want to eat now. Trying to limit them will cause problems. Then you will manage those problems. Because if we allow starving men to gorge themselves on rich food, half will be incapacitated from digestive shock and several will die. We control distribution, or we lose combat effectiveness." The order was medically sound and psychologically brutal. Around the depot, 347 men who had been starving for weeks stood meters from thousands of kilograms of food, being told they could consume only controlled portions. The discipline required to enforce this exceeded what most units could maintain. But the alternative was men dying from the very abundance meant to save them. Matsumoto oversaw distribution for his platoon. Each man received 1 tin of bully beef and 1 tin of biscuits, to be consumed over the course of the day in small portions. The beef tins, containing perhaps 300 grams each, were to be divided into 6 separate portions, consumed hourly. The biscuits, 12 per tin, were to be eaten one at a time. Private Ito received his allocation and immediately opened the beef tin, eating directly from it with his fingers. He consumed perhaps 70 grams before Matsumoto stopped him, physically removing the tin from his hands. Ito began to cry. Not violent sobbing, but steady tears that ran down his face while he stared at the confiscated beef. "I'm so hungry," he said, the words barely intelligible through crying. "I'm so hungry and it's right there and you won't let me eat it. If you eat too much too fast, you'll vomit it up and your body won't absorb any calories. Then you'll be hungry and sick. Small portions, hour intervals. That's how we survive this." But the logic meant nothing against hunger that had become the defining reality of existence. Ito sat on the ground, still crying, staring at the beef tin in Matsumoto's hand with an intensity that suggested he was considering violence to reclaim it. Around the depot, similar scenes played out as soldiers confronted the psychological impossibility of limiting consumption when abundance surrounded them. 3 men ignored the rationing orders and gorged themselves during the first hour. All 3 became violently ill, vomiting within 30 minutes and spending the next several hours in severe digestive distress. 1, Private Yamamoto, age 19, began vomiting blood and was taken to the medical station, where the single remaining medic could offer nothing beyond observation. He died at dusk, his body unable to process the sudden influx of protein and fat after months of near starvation. His death silenced most resistance to the rationing protocol. Men consumed their allocated portions slowly, fearfully, understanding that the food meant to save them could also kill them, if not approached with caution. Matsumoto ate his beef ration in the prescribed manner, taking small amounts every hour. His body responded with mixed signals: relief at receiving calories, nausea from richness his stomach no longer recognized, satisfaction that verged on pain as his digestive system struggled to process real food. He forced himself to stop between portions, to wait the full hour, to resist the overwhelming urge to consume everything immediately. By evening, the battalion had established defensive positions around Kokoda and begun the process of recovering from extended starvation. Medical staff, such as they were, conducted assessments of who was most at risk, who needed priority nutrition, who might not survive, even with food available. Approximately 30 men were classified as critically malnourished, their bodies so depleted that recovery was uncertain even with adequate supply. Sergeant Tanaka sat with Matsumoto near the command post, eating his evening ration of biscuits, one careful bite at a time. The sun was setting behind the Owen Stanley Range, painting the clouds in shades that suggested beauty if one had the mental capacity to process aesthetics. Tanaka chewed slowly, his jaw working with deliberate precision. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.